The Assembly will now hear an address by His Excellency Sergio Mattarella, President of the Republic of Italy. I request protocol to escort His Excellency and invite him to address the Assembly.
Mr. President of the General Assembly, Mr. Secretary General, distinguished permanent representatives, I very much appreciate this opportunity to address you in this hall, which symbolizes the gathering of the wills of peoples. Just 1 year after the 80th anniversary of the foundation of the United Nations, and 70 years after Italy joined the organization. The then newly born Italian Republic's aspiration to join the UN reflected our vocation for multilateralism. And today, I am pleased to reiterate in front of you Italy's determination to cooperate in building a fairer, safer, and more sustainable world, one in which the rights of all peoples and persons can be fully recognized. In 1955, having freed itself from the rubble of the fascist regime and having risen again from the tragedy of World War II by choosing the Republic, Italy was finally accepted within the United Nations, 10 years after the organization was created, and following a long and complex journey. From Rome's point of view, the outcome of the admission request could not have been different, since the fundamental principles of the Italian Republic's Constitution of 1948 are in many ways identical to those which inspire the Charter of the United Nations, the goals of which it shares. With its firm will to avoid repeating past mistakes, the Constitutional Assembly had in fact expressly included provisions allowing the limitation of sovereignty on condition of equality with other states aimed at achieving an order ensuring peace and justice among nations, besides promoting and fostering the international organizations working to achieve these goals. Achieving multilateralism has been the essential pillar of our foreign policy, and we are proud to host UN offices and facilities throughout our territory, from Turin to Rome, from Florence to Trieste to Brindisi. Ladies and gentlemen, the Italian Republic's appreciation of peace, the promotion of human dignity, and of universal values is constantly expressed by supporting dialogue and post-conflict stabilization processes, by supporting the rights of young people and women, especially where discrimination is most serious. And I cannot help mentioning the conditions faced by Afghan and Iranian women, and by supporting the campaign for the abolition of the death penalty. Italy's contribution to UN programs in financial terms and with human resources is no less significant. Italy also ensures the presence of civilian and military contingents to support development programs and peacekeeping operations around the world, often in complex and sensitive settings, beginning with the UNIFIL mission on the border between Lebanon and Israel. All of this entails facing risks, and sometimes, unfortunately, dealing with the loss of human lives. In the quest for peace, there have been many Italian military and civilian victims in countries torn apart by wars in the Middle East and Africa, beginning with the 13 aviators on a UN mission who were slaughtered near Kindu, Congo in 1961. I wish to honor their memory here. Ladies and gentlemen, the multilateralism which inspires Italy's role in the world is also naturally expressed in other contexts, from the European Union, of which we are among the founding countries, to the transatlantic relations within the framework of self-defense organizations in the G7 and G20 and in other international organizations. In all of these settings, Italy works to promote dialogue. Our geographical position in the middle of the Mediterranean, our history, our culture, make Italy a natural bridge between peoples, countries, and civilizations. The global challenges we face require a collective and orderly response by the international community. Within this framework, the United Nations organization is the universal, inclusive, and legitimate institution and platform to deal with these challenges. The functioning of the UN is sometimes criticized, legitimately and at times not groundlessly. We would all wish for more from the UN system, although we are often unwilling to give more by entrusting it with tasks, responsibilities, and the means which would allow it to enhance the effectiveness of its action, without being subject to the mutual vetoes which may end up halting its existence. In the history of humanity, the United Nations rose from the need to overcome the zero-sum game which marked relations among nations. A game with only one rule. One country's victory required another's defeat. Our goal has become to achieve everyone's victory, together. The UN was born from the tragic events of the past. Enormous amounts of death and destruction pushed governments and nations to think of how they could avoid turning the various post-conflict international conferences into mere ways to regulate the balance of power, often leading to the next war, instead of being real exercises in building the future. The UN was created to foster collaboration and respect instead of trying to overwhelm one another. The Charter of the United Nations, which followed the San Francisco Conference, established a number of fundamental principles with great farsightedness: respect for national sovereignty, the right to self-determination of peoples, the obligation to settle international disputes by peaceful means, respect for human rights and personal dignity, without distinction as to ethnicity, religion, or social background. The Charter, together with the Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, is the foundation of the coexistence among peoples. This is a need reflected in its primary goal, that of maintaining peace. Ladies and gentlemen, die-hard nationalism, neo-imperialism, if not neo-colonialism, and the competition, not cooperation, between powers are re-establishing a polarization of the international system which harms the freedom and equality of relations among states and peoples and jeopardizes peace. Now, more than ever, it is important to strengthen multilateral institutions, beginning with the United Nations. The Russian Federation's aggression against Ukraine is a contradiction of the reasons which led to the founding of the UN, and it is all the more serious given that it stems from one of the countries with the most responsibilities within the international community as a permanent member of the Security Council. The defense of the independence of Ukraine, a founding country of the United Nations, has seen Italy and many other international partners committed in upholding international law and the principle that solidarity must be given to nations attacked by acts of bullying, aiming to replace law with military force. That is what Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations requires by enshrining the right to self-defense. No state, no matter how powerful or how equipped it is with a menacing nuclear arsenal, can think of violating principles including the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence of another country without facing sanctions. Russia has taken on the great historic responsibility of having brought war back to the heart of the European continent. The Russian invasion of Ukraine, by the way, isn't merely a regional conflict, if only because its protagonist is a power with the ambition of exercising global influence and with a global role, stemming from the unavoidable responsibility I mentioned, which is that of being a permanent member of the Security Council, something that no one intends to ignore. Each of its actions has a multiplying effect. The United Nations have gone through lengthy periods during which it was paralyzed from the operational standpoint due to the contrasts of the Cold War. The fall of the Iron Curtain led to a new outlook, one also fostered by the dialogue and by the Helsinki Accords in 1975, leading to the Organization for the Security and Cooperation on the European Continent, in the effectiveness of which few invested, unfortunately. Now, Moscow wishes to turn back time, and it has started a new arms race. The effects of the crisis in Europe are being felt globally through the slowing down of efforts to safeguard the planet on the topic of energy, and even more critically, when it comes to food resources. The FAO, along with the other Rome-based agri-food agencies, have contributed to major achievements against world hunger over the past decade. These results are now being thwarted by the risk of a food crisis caused by the conflict in Ukraine, which may jeopardize the livelihoods of millions of people in other regions of the world, especially in certain territories in Africa. Almost 300 million people face food scarcity. In a matter of months, we have wasted the peace dividend, which had allowed the allocation of resources on development instead of arms, following the end of the Cold War. Last year, the global arms expenditure amounted to $2.4 trillion, up 7% compared to the previous year, and the highest in the last 15 years. These resources could be useful in alleviating the humanitarian crises affecting over 100 million human beings by fostering economic and social growth, countering climate change and global health risks, promoting the moral and intellectual development of the younger generations. Instead, because of the expansionist goals of some states, these resources have been destined to the purchase of destructive weapons. Peace is in the interest of all peoples, everywhere. Italy, with other international partners, is firmly committed to achieving a peaceful and a long-lasting solution to this conflict. Not just any solution, though, let alone a solution which would reward the aggressor and humiliate those being attacked, setting a dangerous precedent for everyone. It isn't a matter of reconciliation for reconciliation's sake. If peace is to be fair and long-lasting, it must be based on the noble and inalienable principles of international law and the Charter of the United Nations. The Charter must be the source of inspiration in dealing with the increasingly worrisome winds of war blowing in the Middle East. The tensions and clashes in recent weeks call for the international community's increased efforts for de-escalation. It is one of the Italian Republic's goals in taking over the G7 presidency. The chain of actions and reactions must be put to an end, thus allowing the start of a process to stop the massacres and finally lead to a stable peace. This solution must necessarily envisage the shared goal of full and mutual recognition of the two states of Israel and Palestine, with the final recognition of Israel and its security by the region's states. We are currently asked to respond to the moral imperative of providing assistance to alleviate the huge suffering of Gaza's civilian population. Furthermore, we must avoid the further worsening of the situation, and I wish to echo the Secretary General's plea that military operations in Rafah be avoided, given the dramatic consequences they may have for Palestinian civilians. We must then consider the essential role played by the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East, and consequently, the importance of continuing to fund it. The ceasefire called for by Security Council Resolution number 2728, unconditioned humanitarian access to the population in Gaza, the release of the hostages kidnapped during the inhuman attack on the 7th of October, which is the root cause of what happened subsequently and must be underlined, and the immediate stop to all activities in support of terrorist organizations continue being the pillars upon which a joint diplomatic action must be built with determination. Even the harshest of conflicts cannot allow the violation of the provisions of humanitarian law, as enshrined in the Geneva Convention of 1949, to safeguard civilian populations. With courage and just as much determination, it is necessary to respond to the other crises in that region, which there are many of, unfortunately, including Syria and Yemen. Ensuring the freedom and safety of navigation in the Red Sea is part of the main elements of international coexistence. The militarization of domains such as the sea, the Arctic and Antarctic regions, and space must be countered firmly, as those are domains pertaining to all of humanity. The two conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza have also brought back the sinister threat of using nuclear weapons, as if the history of the 20th century hadn't already made their tragic consequences so obvious. The framework of pacts regarding nuclear arsenals, which was so painstakingly set up over the past decades, is a heritage belonging to all states. Violating that framework, if only through threats, means jeopardizing the destiny of all peoples, including those whose governments threaten the use of nuclear weapons. This is a responsibility that the international community cannot leave without consequences. This picture raises another question, inevitably. The desire to bend the United Nations to unscrupulous particular interests, and the Charter's main goal is constantly being questioned, cannot challenge its universal nature and founding reasons. Italy's choice is to firmly support the actions of the United Nations. It is the very heart of the world governance architecture, and it alone can prevent further human tragedies. Ladies and gentlemen, increasingly often, and despite a renewed dispute between the East and the West, one hears of a contrast between the global North and South, as if it were an element of international competition, something that some would like to take advantage of and depict as a contrast between the West and the rest of the world. The issue of current deep economic and social inequalities is evoked. This is a topic which was initially dealt with through the Charter of Economic Rights and Duties of States, approved by the General Assembly in 1974, an important milestone in upholding international justice. The 2030 Agenda and the pursuit of its goals isn't an exercise in bureaucracy for dreamers. In fact, it matches the UN's vocation in achieving global progress. Were we to measure the economic results brought about by the prevalence of multilateralism, we would notice that since 1950, the average yearly per capita income of the world's population has grown fourfold. A major success, if we also take into account that our population has tripled over the same period. This is even more significant if you consider that the percentage of the world's population living on less than $2 per day dropped from 75% to 10% over the period. The often artificial depiction of reality is contradicted by constant cooperation experiences between the North and South, with partnerships between countries from every global region, with the United Nations offering plenty of examples of effectiveness and success. In any case, we cannot question the fact that in our work to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, our states are in the best possible conditions to achieve the goals. They must commit more, with the awareness that challenges like climate change and food insecurity require different levels of responsibilities. Italy is firmly committed in this regard, as proven by yesterday's conference here at the UN on the state of implementation of SDG 16, one of the more complex and crucial goals of the 2030 Agenda. There is also the need to truly adjust the international financial system, which was designed many decades ago, when the international community's conditions were quite different. The difficulties encountered by countries facing crises and the growth of countries and continents such as Africa are absolute priorities, so that these countries can also develop their huge potential. I was personally able to take stock of the great prospects for the African continent. Not only is that continent the cradle of humanity, it also represents much of its future, especially given the creativity and energy of its younger generations, along with the major opportunities for its future. Italy is especially interested in promoting a fair, broad, and comprehensive partnership with the African countries, with the awareness that Africa's development is in Europe's common interest, and it is essential in successfully dealing with the challenges we face. This is Italy's approach in working with our African partners, with the African Union and other regional organizations, as a way of promoting the development of countries which are so geographically close to us. This is also proven by the recent Italy-Africa Summit in Rome last January and the launching of the Mattei Plan for the continent's sustainable development. Dealing with the many conflicts which persist in Africa requires a renewed capacity to foster dialogue and cooperation, along with our African partners' full commitment to local peace-building processes and the strengthening of their political and social and economic fabric. This is also the meaning behind Italy's support to Security Council Resolution number 2719. This is an initial and partial implementation of the proposals included in the Secretary General's new Agenda for Peace, which Italy firmly supports for its innovative spirit based on the lessons we have learned in the recent past on the topic of conflict resolution. It focuses on prevention initiatives and a truly comprehensive and inclusive approach in achieving all the conditions needed to support and enhance peace processes. Ladies and gentlemen, Africa and the Middle East along with other regions in Latin America and Asia, and even Europe, are all witnessing an increase in humanitarian crises, both brought about by conflict and exacerbated by the climate crises, as in the case of small islands, especially in the Pacific, and worsened by local contexts marked by frailty. The international community, including Italy, has not spared itself in its efforts to identify the resources needed to meet these emerging needs. The UN response system has proven capable of organizing the required intervention plans, often proving to be the only player able to operate in the most difficult contexts. Despite all of this, the gap between available resources and the needs to be met continue to be enormous. The UN is the only platform, as long as it is adequately supported by its member states, it is the only platform capable of dealing with the threats to peace, security, and development. I'd like to underscore the concept of adequate support, since the United Nations exists due to the political will and contribution of the states belonging to it. Any initiative to revitalize its activities and functioning can only start from the determination of its 193 states to commit more. And the number I have just mentioned would be more than enough to guarantee the UN's success. 193 members. There were 51 countries when the organization was created. And my presence in this hall, which is called upon to set the international agenda, is a way of reiterating Italy's firm commitment in supporting the UN as it works to renew itself and to face the new and current challenges we face. Ladies and gentlemen, the major transnational challenges we face, the increase in regional conflicts, which may expand, underscore the UN's essential and crucial role in serving humanity instead of questioning its importance. We need the United Nations organizations to be increasingly representative and effective. Anything else, any other way, any absence would lead to a worsening of the outlook for our human condition. We know that the United Nations reflect various aspirations and the complexities of its members. All of this is a way of strengthening the reasons behind its founding reasons, urging us to renew the organizations. For years now, we have been discussing how to reform the system so that this organization can be updated, so that it can respond to the changing international scenario and the political, social, and economic developments in various countries and regions. And from this point of view, I want to express my gratitude for the Secretary General's actions in promoting an updating of the agenda and a reform of the system. Italy fully supports the proposals made on the organizational, management, and working method levels of the UN, and also regarding any possible intervention to promote development, peace, and security, as identified in our common agenda. An agenda which was drafted based on the input of the UN membership so that the organization can be more effective, responsible, and results-oriented. Within the reform of the UN, and more in general, of the international relations system, the upcoming Summit of the Future will be an opportunity for the success of the global multilateral architecture. The United Nations fosters diplomacy, but it cannot merely solve the power relations between states. It is called upon to deal with the fate of humanity. It has to solve its problems. And the attention given by most countries to September Summit and to the Pact for the Future is justified by what is at stake. Often, in times of great crisis, we are able to find the strength and courage required to strive towards the common good. The reform of the global governance, which will be synthesized by the Pact for the Future, will have to guarantee an inclusive process for all players on the international scene, both as far as countries are concerned and as far as regional groups are concerned. And when it comes to the African group, or the small island developing states, or the Arab groups, are all marked by legitimate and common interests. This inclusive process, of course, cannot forget all of the other players, especially civil society representatives who look to the UN and who are often in the front line in contributing to the planet's sustainable development. And the goal of inclusivity is a part of Italy's proposal, together with the countries united for consensus, to bring about a reform and better representation in the Security Council. Its goal is to give greater representation to underrepresented continents like Africa, Asia, and Latin America, as a way of remedying a historical injustice which is so obvious. The UN institutions were designed on the relations stemming from World War II, on war. The time has come to design the organization on peace by taking into account the positive continental cooperation initiatives which have grown in recent decades. Think of the African Union or the European Union and similar efforts in other regions of the world. A reformed council could reconcile the growth of its membership with a fair regional representation, along with the need to preserve and even improve its capacity, its ability to make decisions, which have been jeopardized by the current political polarization and by the excessive use of vetoes by permanent members. Italy will continue to give its active and positive contribution to the drafting of the Pact for the Future, so that we can reach a shared vision of the tools and actions required to deal with the challenges of the 21st century together. Ladies and gentlemen, as I conclude my remarks, I'd like to quote a UN Secretary General we have fond memories of. On the eve of this millennium, Kofi Annan said that global challenges have something in common. They know no borders, and even the strongest of states is helpless in front of them. An idea which led him to state that more than ever before in human history, we share a common destiny. We can master it only if we face it together, and that is why we have the United Nations. These are very wise words indeed, and 2 decades later, they appear to be even more crucial and must push us to commit fruitfully in consolidating this organization and its rules, which must be promoted and made effective. Thank you.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I should like to thank His Excellency the President of the Republic of Italy for the statement just made.